So if you're joining us today, you are probably here because you want to get past all the standard surface level stuff and really satisfy a deep curiosity about today's topic.
Yeah, we are absolutely cutting through the information overload today.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to take a really extensive look into the prayer life of Jesus of Nazareth.
Which is honestly a massive topic. I mean, we've got a huge stack of sources here.
We really do. We're talking linguistic analyses
Yeah.
of ancient Aramaic, Greek translations, historical breakdowns of his parables, and theological encyclopedias.
And we're not just looking at what he prayed, right? We are dissecting how and why he prayed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to just read the text as a list of words.
Yeah.
But we want to find those aha moments.
Right, because Jesus didn't use prayer as like a passive vending machine for requests.
Yeah, that vending machine mentality is so common today. But he used it as an active framework. It was a way to connect with the divine, engage in spiritual warfare, and just maintain a heavenly perspective.
While dealing with absolute earthly chaos, I might add. So true. So before we even get into the specific words he used, I think we need to look at his actual habits.
Yeah, the mechanics of it. How did he physically and chronologically approach prayer?
Right, because if you picture a man sweating blood, falling on his face in the dirt, and literally screaming into the dark, I mean, you wouldn't call that a peaceful morning devotion?
No, you'd call it a total crisis. You'd assume the guy was having a breakdown.
Exactly. But if we look at the historical records, this visceral, agonizing struggle wasn't a breakdown at all.
No, it was his preferred method of communication. It was the absolute bedrock of his daily existence.
Which completely shatters that sterile, quiet time imagery we usually associate with ancient spirituality.
Oh, totally. When we dig into the primary texts and the historical context of the first century, we see a figure who treated prayer like a grueling, essential mechanism for survival.
Yeah, and in the Greco-Roman world, communication with the divine was fundamentally transactional, right?
It was this concept of, basically, I give so that you might give.
Like a contract. Exactly. You offer the sacrifice, the god grants the favor, and the transaction clears. It was a cosmic patron-client relationship.
You didn't seek intimacy with Jupiter or Mars. You just wanted leverage.
Right, or protection. But Jesus approached the divine from a completely different paradigm. He wasn't negotiating a contract, he was plugging into a lifeline.
Which brings us to the chronological approach, which is just exhausting to even read about.
It really is. Like, take the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1. It says that while it was still dark, Jesus left the house to go to a secluded place to pray.
And it's so easy for us to picture that as a serene sunrise with a cup of coffee.
Right. But the historical context of a first-century Galilean ministry just destroys that romantic image.
Oh, completely. Because you had to factor in the sheer sensory overload of what he was doing during the day.
Yeah, first-century crowds were aggressive. They were desperate, pressing in on him.
No personal space at all.
None. And no crowd control. He was constantly surrounded by disease, severe physical ailments, and demonic afflictions.
The physical and emotional toll of healing and teaching under those conditions would just leave a person completely depleted.
Absolutely drained. Yet his immediate instinct isn't to sleep in and recover physically.
Right. His instinct is to seek absolute isolation. And Luke points out that this was a constant rhythm for him.
Yeah, a deliberate escape from the madness. And it wasn't just a quick morning check-in either.
No, the duration is staggering. Like in Luke 6, where it details Jesus retreating to a mountain and praying all night.
All night. And the timing of that specific marathon session is really the key detail there.
Because it's right before he selects the 12 disciples, right?
Exactly. He's about to establish the core leadership structure that will carry his movement to the ends of the earth.
So he spends a massive amount of undivided time in the dark before making a decision that literally alters history.
It's incredible. And when you read these accounts, the dynamic between Jesus and his followers starts to look like a massive misunderstanding.
A misunderstanding of where the power actually comes from.
Yes. The crowds and the disciples are staring at the miracles and the authoritative teaching.
It's like they're looking at water rushing out of an aqueduct and just marveling at the force of the stream.
That's a great analogy. They think the action is the source.
But Jesus knows the aqueduct isn't the source. The solitary all-night prayer, that's the hidden reservoir.
Right, and if you don't spend time at the reservoir, the aqueduct eventually runs completely dry.
Like a smartphone battery. The disciples thought the healing and preaching was the battery, but Jesus knew solitary prayer was the charger.
Yeah, and without the charger, the device just dies. The disciples were mesmerized by the output, but totally blind to the input.
And we actually see the blindness lead to a complete disaster in Mark chapter 9, don't we?
We do. Jesus is away on a mountain, and a father brings his severely afflicted child to the disciples.
And they try to cast out this demonic presence, and they just fail publicly.
Completely fail.
Yeah.
By the time Jesus gets back down to the valley, the disciples aren't reevaluating their methods.
No, they're just arguing with the religious scribes in the crowd.
Right. They're acting like standard first-century exorcists, trying to rely on a formula or their own perceived agency.
They're turning the crank on an empty reservoir.
Exactly. So Jesus steps in, resolves the crisis, and later, behind closed doors, the disciples ask him, "Why couldn't we drive it out?"
And his response is just staggering.
He says, "This kind can come out only by prayer." It's a massive indictment of what they were doing.
Because they had engaged in public spectacle, they had argued with the crowd, but they hadn't actually engaged with God.
Right. For Jesus, prayer wasn't an accessory to the action. It was the engine itself.
And an engine running at that capacity generates a lot of heat.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to that visceral intensity.
Yeah, the writer of Hebrews captures this perfectly. It really strips away centuries of that stoic, emotionally detached religious artwork.
Right. Hebrews 5:7 says he offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears.
And that full-body distress reaches its absolute peak in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yeah, where Luke uses medical terminology to describe his sweat becoming like great drops of blood.
Which points to hematidrosis. It's a rare but documented physiological response to profound, life-threatening terror.
Wow. Where the capillaries literally burst into the sweat glands.
Exactly. This isn't a philosopher calmly accepting his fate. It's a man wrestling in the dirt, absorbing the crushing weight of what's about to happen.
And his physical posture matches that internal agony. Mark 14 explicitly notes that he fell to the ground.
Yeah, falling prostrate in the dirt is the ultimate sign of absolute submission and destitution in the ancient Near East.
But he also lifted his eyes to heaven and even sang hymns as a form of prayer before leaving the upper room.
He utilized every spectrum of human expression: song, screaming, silent bleating.
And observing all of this, the disciples finally start to connect the dots.
They watch the early mornings, the tears, the unprecedented authority, and they finally recognize that the reservoir is what matters.
Which prompts them to ask, Lord, teach us to pray.
And when they ask that, he doesn't hand them a theological treatise or a magical incantation.
No, he gives them a highly specific structural framework, what we now call the Lord's Prayer.
Found in Matthew 6 and Luke 11. And the very first thing this framework does is completely invert human instinct.
Right, because the natural tendency, especially in that Roman culture, is a problem-centric approach.
Yeah, handing God an itemized to-do list.
But he shifts it to a God-centric orientation. You establish the relationship before you make a single request.
And the specific word he chooses, Abba, has sparked this intense, decades-long linguistic debate.
I found the sources on this debate absolutely fascinating because it dismantles a really popular modern myth.
Oh, the daddy myth.
Yes. I've heard my whole life that Abba is essentially ancient Aramaic for daddy or papa, like baby talk. Is that actually true?
Well, it took the theological world by storm in the mid-20th century, mostly due to a German scholar named Joachim Jeremias.
Okay, so he popularized the idea.
Yeah, he posited that Abba was the babbling sound of a small child, introducing this shocking level of informal intimacy to the divine.
It's a very comforting picture, which is probably why it became so entrenched in modern sermons.
But more recent linguistic analyses by scholars like James Barr and Michael S. Heiser really push back on that.
They basically take a sledgehammer to Jeremias' conclusion, don't they?
They do. They demonstrate that while Abba did originate in the nursery, by the 1st century, it had evolved.
So adults were using it.
Yes. It was regularly used by adult children addressing their fathers in solemn, responsible discourse. It was even a title of deep respect for honored teachers.
And James Barr argues that reducing it to childish prattle actually robs the text of its most profound nuance.
Exactly. Translating it strictly as daddy guts it of its majesty.
So how should we understand it?
Through the lens of a 1st century adult, it perfectly balances profound familial intimacy with supreme holiness and respect.
It's an adult acknowledging their loving creator, not a toddler asking for a toy.
Right. Recognizing the absolute closeness, but never losing sight of the sovereign authority of the Father.
And you see that balance maintained in the very next breath. Hallowed be your name.
Yeah, the intimacy of Abba doesn't cancel out the terrifying holiness of the divine name.
and asking for the kingdom to come that carries massive eschatological and ethical weight.
The St. Andrew's Encyclopedia source breaks this down brilliantly. It's an eschatological hope looking forward to the end of time.
A plea for the final establishment of God's justice.
But early commentators point out it's also an ethical demand for the present moment.
Because you can't genuinely pray for God's rule globally if you're subverting it locally in your own life.
Exactly. When the early church prayed, "Hallowed be your name," they believed they were actively hallowing it by how they lived.
By rescuing abandoned infants, sharing wealth, and refusing to participate in imperial cults, by living virtuously, they bring heaven to earth.
It's an enlistment. You're surrendering your own agenda, which makes the sudden pivot in the prayer so jarring.
Right. You move from the cosmic scope of God's global reign down to this microscopic human anxiety. Give us today our daily bread.
And this petition contains what might be the most intriguing linguistic ghost in the entire New Testament.
The Greek word epiousios.
Yes, and when sources say it's a ghost word, they mean it is a total anomaly.
It only exists in this exact prayer, right?
Nowhere else. No secular texts, no other biblical texts, no trade documents, nowhere.
That sounds like a translator's nightmare.
It really is. Linguists have spent 2 millennia breaking it down into root components to decipher what it means.
So what are the theories?
Well, the first derives from roots, meaning for the current day, giving us daily bread.
Make a sense.
The second traces roots, meaning to come, suggesting bread for tomorrow or a taste of the future heavenly banquet right now.
Okay, but the third theory in the sources is the one that really tripped me up.
The supersubstantial bread.
Yes.
Yes.
Early church fathers like Origen and Jerome with Latin Vulgate broke it down into epi meaning above and ousia meaning substance.
So Jerome translates it into Latin as supersubstantialis.
It sounds like a sci-fi concept, like Jesus wasn't talking about physical calories at all.
Well, Origen and Jerome were leaning heavily into the spiritual implications. They interpreted it as the Eucharist or spiritual nourishment.
Food that sustains the eternal soul.
Right. But modern scholars suggest it likely demands a dual reading.
Because the audience's cultural memory is anchored in the Exodus, relying on literal manna to survive.
Exactly. He's absolutely addressing their physical vulnerability, but simultaneously pointing to divine sustenance.
The physical and spiritual are totally intertwined. And once survival is addressed, the framework turns to the community.
The petition for forgiveness. And here we had a really fascinating divergence between Matthew and Luke.
Yes, Matthew says, forgive us our debts, while Luke says, forgive us our sins.
And the sources explain this discrepancy by looking at the target demographics of the authors.
Matthew is writing to a Jewish Christian audience who deeply understood the Torah and the concept of the Jubilee year.
Yeah, we have to understand how crushing the economic reality of the first century Roman world was for agrarian Galileans.
They were squeezed by Roman taxes, local taxes, temple taxes. It was a debt trap economy.
Families were constantly losing land and being sold into debt slavery.
So the Old Testament law of the Jubilee, a society-wide economic reset every 50 years where debts were canceled, was the ultimate dream.
Right, so when Matthew's Jesus tells indebted Galileans to pray, forgive us our debts, he's using a politically explosive word.
He takes the literal socio-economic desperation and turns it into a towering metaphor for our spiritual condition.
A desperate plea for a spiritual jubilee. But Luke is writing to Gentile, Greek-speaking Christians.
And if he uses the literal translation of debts, a Roman reader might think Jesus is just offering financial advice.
Exactly. They might think it's a prayer to clear their ledgers with local merchants. The metaphor wouldn't land at all.
So Luke translates it directly into sin so they wouldn't miss the point.
But regardless of the word used, the second half acts as a terrifying mirror.
As we also have forgiven our debtors. Jesus explicitly ties God's forgiveness to our willingness to forgive others.
It's the ultimate ethical demand for reconciliation. You can't hoard bitterness while demanding God erase your cosmic bankruptcy.
It enforces absolute humility, which we definitely need as we move into the final, highly controversial petition, lead us not into temptation.
The theological tension here is massive. You can see why Pope Francis recently suggested adjusting the translation.
Yeah, to do not let us fall into temptation, right? Because the traditional wording implies a loving God might actively lay traps for his children.
Which contradicts other scriptures, like James, which explicitly states God tempts no one.
So what does the original Greek actually say?
The word is parasmos, which carries a heavily nuanced dual meaning. It means temptation, but it can also mean a trial or a crucible meant to refine character.
And the early believers understood trials were inevitable. Even Jesus was led into the wilderness by the Spirit to undergo parasmos before his ministry.
Right. The prayer isn't accusing God of planting landmines. It's a sober acknowledgement of human weakness.
Begging for deliverance from the evil one and the strength to endure spiritual combat.
Exactly. So we have the physical mechanics and the verbal framework, but what happens when a prayer goes unanswered?
Does the framework expire? This is where Jesus addresses the attitude of prayer through a pretty jarring parable in Luke 18.
The parable of the weary judge. And to understand the stakes, we have to look at the standing of a first-century widow.
She had zero social leverage, no financial capital for bribes, and no physical protection.
The embodiment of powerlessness in a corrupt system. And Jesus explicitly describes the judge as one who neither feared God nor cared what people thought.
He's callous, totally self-interested, and just ignores her plea for justice.
But the widow has one weapon: sheer, unrelenting persistence. She creates such an annoyance that the corrupt judge finally breaks.
He basically says, I'll give her justice so she won't eventually come and attack me or wear me out.
It's a brilliant, slightly comedic caricature, but the theological whiplash comes when we try to map this onto God.
Okay, right. This parable feels totally counterintuitive. Is Jesus seriously comparing God to a corrupt, annoyed judge who only helps us if we badger him enough?
It would be confusing if this were a direct allegorical comparison, but rabbinic experts point out Jesus is using a specific Jewish argumentative structure.
Called qual Homer, right? Arguing from the lesser to the greater.
Exactly. This is a parable of stark contrast, not comparison.
He's setting up the worst possible scenario to prove a point about the best possible scenario.
Right. If even a finite, deeply flawed, selfish, earthly judge will eventually respond to persistent pleading,
how much more will an infinite, perfectly loving heavenly judge respond to his children?
the objective is to eradicate doubt. If persistence works on a bad judge, it's absolutely not wasted on a good God.
So the lesson isn't that we have to annoy God or grind down his resistance. The persistence changes us.
Yes. A prolonged season of persistent prayer acts as a spiritual refiner's fire. It burns away superficial desires.
If God instantly granted every request, we'd treat him entirely like that cosmic vending machine.
We'd be obsessed with the gifts, never developing a sustained relationship with the giver.
The delay forces dependence. It aligns our hearts with divine timing and builds spiritual resilience.
And Luke explicitly states the parable's purpose: to show them that they should always pray and not give up.
An antidote to despair in the face of silence.
Now, we've traced the mechanics, the framework, and the attitude, but all of this has been instructional.
Right. As we move to the final source in our stack, the dynamic fundamentally shifts. We're entering the inner sanctum.
The longest, most intimate recorded prayer of Jesus himself, the high priestly prayer of John 17.
And the geography and timing of this prayer are just loaded with tension.
It's the night of his betrayal, moments after the Last Supper, moments before he crosses the Kidron Valley to Gethsemane.
The machinery of his execution is already in motion. Judas has left the room.
And in this incredibly compressed window of time, Jesus stops and delivers a masterpiece of intercession.
How is it structured? The sources point out a very specific design.
Yes,
Yes.
a concentric three-part structure. He prays for himself, then for his immediate disciples, and finally for all future believers.
Let's look at that first part, where he prays, glorify your son. Honestly, out of context, that sounds almost selfish.
To a Roman mind, glory meant military triumph and the subjugation of enemies. But John's gospel completely redefines glory.
When Jesus says the hour has come, he isn't talking about a military uprising. He's talking about the cross.
Exactly. He views his impending ultimate suffering not as a defeat, but as the supreme, radiant display of God's character.
God's glory is his self-sacrificial love for a broken world. So the cross is actually the coronation.
Yes. He secures his own agonizing path, and then the prayer expands to the second movement, the 11 disciples in the room.
And he knows they're about to be hunted and scattered. But his request for them totally defies our modern instinct for self-preservation.
He says, I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one.
He doesn't ask for an evacuation or a secure bubble.
Because if they're evacuated, the mission dies. They have to remain inside the hostile system.
But he asks for protection and for them to be sanctified in the truth.
Which he defines as God's word. Deep immersion in the truth is what will keep them distinct from the surrounding culture.
Then we hit the third movement. And this is where it bridges directly to us. He looks across the centuries and prays for future believers.
He foresees the massive global expansion of the movement.
And knowing everything this future body will face, world wars, schisms, cultural revolutions, what is his desperate, dying request?
He doesn't pray for flawless theology or massive wealth. He prays for one seemingly impossible thing: unity.
That they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you.
It's incredible.
I was trying to map this onto a modern equivalent. It's like a founder leaving a company, and their final wish to the board isn't about profit margins.
It's just, please don't turn on each other.
Because the greatest threat to the church is never external persecution. It's internal fracture.
But the unity he's requesting isn't just a polite corporate merger. It's modeled on the Trinity, a supernatural oneness of love.
And he explicitly states the reason: so that the world may believe. True unity has a missional purpose.
The Roman world was brutally fractured, just like our modern world. When a diverse community demonstrates radical unity, it breaks all sociological rules.
It provides visible, indisputable proof of the gospel to a skeptical world.
It really forces the observer to ask, what is holding them together?
So to recap this journey we've been on, we started with the solitary bleeding sweat of Jesus' early mornings.
We saw how he viewed prayer not as an accessory, but as the hidden reservoir.
We deconstructed the framework, looking at the exact linguistic weight of Abba and Epiousios.
We explored the explosive nature of asking for a spiritual jubilee and the parable of the corrupt judge.
Learning that persistence isn't a tactic to annoy God, but a crucible to align our hearts.
And we witnessed the total redefinition of glory in his final intercession.
But there is one final mind-bending reality embedded in the sources that we haven't touched on.
Right, and it alters how we apply all of this today. Romans 8 and Hebrews 7 reveal that Jesus and the Holy Spirit are still praying.
Wait, really? The historical texts claim the intercession is still happening right now?
Yes, the prayer life of Jesus didn't end at the ascension. Romans 8 states that when you don't know how to pray, the Spirit intercedes for you.
With groanings too deep for words.
And Hebrews says Jesus always lives to make intercession for them. The high priestly prayer was just the prologue.
So the ultimate takeaway from this deep dive isn't just mimicking a first-century framework.
No, it's the overwhelming realization that right now you are actively being prayed for by the divine.
When your own reservoir runs dry, the Son and the Spirit are carrying the transmission for you. You were never actually praying alone.
The lifeline is always active.
Wow. Thank you all for going on this deep dive with us. We invite you to carry this framework into your own lives, find your secluded place, and plug into the reservoir.